The station of Vel Sarath did not appear on the transport's external display the way Elliot had expected it to. He had studied the briefing files. He had looked at the photographs, the schematics, the cultural attaché's careful watercolor sketches that were meant to prepare the human nervous system for what the eyes were about to encounter. None of it had worked. The station emerged from the space between the two suns the way a thought emerges in the moment before sleep. Suddenly, completely, with the unsettling quality of something that had always been there and was only now permitting itself to be seen. Elliot pressed his palm flat against the viewport glass and said nothing, because there was nothing in his vocabulary calibrated for a structure that size existing in a place that empty. Behind him, the transport's only other passenger, a junior cultural liaison named Priya who had made this trip 4 times, and had therefore developed the practiced calm of someone who had already done all their panicking, looked up from her reading and said, without particular drama, "It helps if you breathe." He breathed. It helped marginally. The docking procedure took 40 minutes, during which Vel Sarath grew in the viewport from something abstract into something that reorganized his understanding of what a building was allowed to be. The spires were obsidian and curved, catching the doubled light of the two suns, and doing something with it that glass shouldn't technically be able to do. The atmospheric dome sat along the station's upper tier like soap bubbles that had decided to be permanent, each one containing what the briefing files had described as garden environments, and what Elliot's eyes were now insisting was a small, entire forest, suspended in the vacuum of space, thriving. A garden in space. He had been told this. He had read this. He had apparently not believed it until this moment, in the same way a person can read about a very cold ocean and still be startled by the cold when they enter it. "The gardens are climate-controlled," Priya said, still not looking up from her reading. "The dome material has a tensile strength that doesn't have a human measurement equivalent yet. The official Vahari name for it translates approximately to the substance that does not break, which their engineers consider a perfectly adequate technical designation." She turned a page. "I find that detail either very reassuring or extremely alarming, depending on my mood." Elliot decided not to ask which mood she was currently in. The protocol officer who met them at the docking bay was Vahari, tall and still, her bioluminescent markings tracing her collarbone and jaw in a slow pulse of pale amber. She introduced herself as Coordinator Ven, and delivered a welcome address that Elliot's translation device rendered into English with the slightly formal cadence of something that had been composed by committee and memorized, which it almost certainly had. It was gracious and precise, and lasted exactly 4 minutes. And when it was finished, Ven looked at Elliot with silver eyes that held a quality he would spend the next several days trying to identify, before arriving at the conclusion that it was the specific patience of a person waiting to find out what kind of problem you were going to be. He smiled. She did not smile back, which his briefing documents had prepared him for. The Vahari did not smile as greeting. Showing teeth in a social context carried implications that his briefing documents had described as contextually complex, and that Priya, who had been on 3 previous postings in Vahari space, described in the transport corridor afterward as "don't do it more than once and don't do it near anyone's children." Elliot made a note. His quarters were in the eastern wing, 3 levels below the formal reception suites, at the end of a corridor that smelled of filtered air and something floral that wasn't quite a flower. The room was large in the way that rooms are large when they have been built for a species with different ideas about where a ceiling should be. He stood in the center of it for a moment, calculating. The ceiling was at least 6 meters up. The furniture was elegant and wrong in the specific way of furniture that has been designed from descriptions rather than experience. The sleep surface was the right height but the wrong width. The table was positioned for someone whose arms reached further, and there were 2 chairs that looked comfortable for approximately the first 30 seconds, and after which, Elliot suspected, would begin to make philosophical arguments against sitting. He put his bag down. He unpacked, as he always did first, the things that were not work, his 2 paperback books, their spines cracked from rereading, a photograph of his daughter at her school recital, squinting into the light with the expression she made when she was trying not to look excited about something, a small wooden spinning top, old enough that the paint had rubbed off in the middle, and a deck of cards that had been with him since his posting on Europa and had outlasted 2 diplomatic crises and 1 moderately serious miscommunication involving a trade delegation and a misidentified fish. He arranged them on the low table near the window. Outside, the second sun was beginning its slow approach to the horizon, and the light it made against the obsidian spires was a color he didn't have a word for. He stood and looked at it for a while. Tomorrow, the summit would begin, and he would be the first human ambassador to conduct formal negotiations with the Vahari Empire, and 18 months of careful preparation would either hold or it would not. But the light on the spires was extraordinary, and he was still looking at it when the station's ambient chimes signaled the first evening, and somewhere in the palace, in a corridor he had not yet walked and would not walk for another 3 days, a small girl with silver eyes and gold-lit markings was already, quietly, noticing that something new had arrived. The first formal session of the Vel Sarath summit began at the hour the Vahari called the second light, which was the moment both suns were simultaneously above the station's horizon, and the light they produced together turned every reflective surface in the palace into something that required squinting. Elliot arrived 4 minutes early, which Priya had told him was the correct interval. Arriving too early suggested anxiety, arriving on time suggested arrogance, and arriving late suggested a career change. He stood outside the chamber doors in his formal diplomatic attire, which had been pressed by the transport's automated system into a state of precision that he was already in the process of compromising by standing with his hands in his pockets, and he went over his opening remarks one final time. They were good remarks. He had written them over 6 weeks and revised them 11 times, and had them reviewed by 3 different cultural consultants, 2 linguists, and 1 exasperated colleague who had told him they were fine and to stop revising them. He had revised them twice more after that. The chamber was a long oval room with walls that were not quite walls, composed instead of some material that held light in its surface and released it slowly, so that the room appeared to generate its own illumination from within rather than receiving it from any identifiable source. The Vahari delegation was already seated when he entered, 7 figures arranged along one side of a table that was low by human standards and appeared to have been grown rather than constructed, its surface continuous with the floor in a way that suggested the whole room was one organism that had decided to become furniture. At the head of the delegation sat the Empress, and whatever Elliot had thought he was prepared for, he discovered in the first 3 seconds of seeing her in formal context that he had been prepared for approximately 60% of it. The other 40% was the way she occupied a room, not dominantly, not aggressively, but with the particular completeness of something that has never once considered the possibility that the room might not want it there. He delivered his opening remarks. The translation system rendered them into Vahari in real time, a process he had been assured was accurate to within a 92% contextual fidelity, which sounded excellent until you considered that the remaining 8% was doing unspecified things to his words in a language he couldn't monitor. The Empress listened without expression. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed at a steady, unreadable frequency. When he finished, she responded, and the translation system gave him back something that was formally gracious and structurally impenetrable, and contained at least one phrase that the device rendered as the understanding between new things, which either meant something profound about diplomatic relations or was an idiom about weather. He wrote it down to ask Priya about later. By midday, they had covered resource corridor transit rights, dual sovereignty definitions in unmapped space, and a preliminary framework for communications protocol that had required 40 minutes of negotiation over a single word, because the Vahari term being translated as agreement apparently carried 17 contextual inflections that each implied a different level of commitment, and the translation system had been defaulting to the third one, which connoted something closer to polite acknowledgement between parties who have not yet decided to trust each other. This was, his lead cultural consultant had once told him, technically the most accurate rendering available. He was beginning to suspect she had been right. At no point during the morning session did Elliot see the princess. He knew she existed from the briefing files. One child, 7 years Vahari age, kept largely away from formal diplomatic proceedings per a palace protocol that his documents described as standard protective practice for the imperial line. He had seen her once briefly from a distance, during the opening ceremony the previous day, a small figure in ceremonial attire near the back of the formal reception hall, standing with the careful stillness of a child who has been instructed to stand still, and is executing this instruction with complete technical precision and zero authentic enthusiasm. She had silver eyes that were too large for her face in the way of children who will grow into them, and she had looked out across the assembly with an expression that Elliot had recognized immediately because his daughter wore it every time she was required to attend a school event that did not directly concern her. The expression of a person who is physically present and intellectually elsewhere, and is being polite enough not to make this anyone else's problem. He had thought briefly that he would like to show her the spinning top. Then the ceremony had continued, and the thought had moved on the way thoughts do during important events, filed somewhere in the back of the mind where small observations go to wait. The afternoon session covered communications infrastructure, and went sideways in the first 20 minutes when it emerged that the human proposal for relay station placement had been drafted using a star map that was 18 months out of date, which meant 3 of the proposed coordinates were now inside a region the Vahari had reclassified as protected astronomical heritage space, which Elliot learned about when the Empress's chief science counselor placed a flat hand on the table in a gesture his translation device flagged as significant without elaborating further. There was a recess. Priya appeared at his elbow with a revised map, a glass of something that was technically water but tasted like an apology, and the composed expression of someone who had anticipated this particular problem and had not mentioned it earlier on the grounds that it was good for him to encounter some difficulties organically. He appreciated this about her in the same way a person appreciates rain, more in retrospect than in the moment. The session resumed. The coordinates were renegotiated. By the time the second light had completed its arc, and the chamber's interior glow had shifted from gold to something cooler and quieter, they had recovered most of the lost ground, and Elliot had developed a working theory about the Empress's bioluminescent markings. That the slow pulse meant she was listening carefully, that the brief acceleration meant something had surprised her, and that the long still pause meant she was deciding something and preferred not to be interrupted while she did it. He wrote this theory in his notes under the heading possibly correct, possibly wishful thinking. He had a lot of entries under that heading. That evening, alone in his quarters, he sat on the floor with his cards and played solitaire and did not think about the summit for 45 minutes, which was the closest thing to rest that the job allowed. He turned the spinning top in his fingers without setting it going. Outside, the station had entered its dark interval, the time between the two suns when Vel Sarath ran on its own interior light, and the corridors beyond his window glowed with the soft bioluminescence of the moss that lined the walls, so that the whole palace breathed with a light that was alive. And in the eastern corridor, 3 levels above him, a small girl with silver eyes stood outside a slightly different door than usual and listened, with her head tilted at the particular angle of someone hearing something they do not yet have a category for, to the faint and unidentifiable sound of a human being humming to himself in an empty room. The third day of the summit began with what Priya described, with the professional detachment of someone who had learned not to attach emotionally to scheduling documents as a restructured agenda, and what Elliot recognized as the diplomatic equivalent of waking up to find that the furniture had moved overnight. 3 items had been quietly removed from the morning session and replaced with a single extended discussion on cultural exchange frameworks, which sounded collaborative and warm and meant, in practical terms, that someone on the Vihari side had decided the previous 2 days had produced enough concrete progress, and it was time to slow down and make sure both parties were actually talking about the same things when they used words like partnership and mutual boundary respect, and the long and shared horizon, which was a phrase the translation device kept producing with the confidence of something that knew it was rendering the syntax correctly, and had made peace with not being certain about the meaning. Elliot arrived at the chamber 4 minutes early. He sat down. He organized his notes. He drank the beverage that had been placed at his position, which tasted like green tea filtered through an entirely different planet's idea of what green was, and was either very good or very unusual, and he had stopped being able to tell the difference on the second day. The Empress arrived. The session began. It was, by the standards of the previous 2 days, almost comfortable. The tone had shifted from the careful formality of opening positions into something slightly more conversational. The kind of register that emerges when people who have been watching each other cautiously for 48 hours have started to form preliminary theories about who the other person actually is, and are beginning, tentatively, to act on those theories. For approximately the first 2 hours, it went well. Sarath asked him about the human concept of archival memory, physical records. She meant things made of material rather than stored in field systems. And he explained about paper and printing and the particular human attachment to objects that could be held. And she listened with the focused stillness that he had by now identified as genuine interest rather than diplomatic performance. He told her about libraries. She found this extraordinary in a way that her expression did not fully show, but that her markings communicated clearly, pulsing in the accelerated pattern he'd logged under surprised. He did not mention that he had 2 physical books in his quarters, because it seemed like exactly the sort of detail that would either delight or alarm her, and he didn't yet have enough data to predict which. At the 107th minute of the session, Counselor Deva entered the chamber. She entered through the side door rather than the main entrance, which was the first thing. The second thing was that she moved to the senior protocol officer's position and delivered a message in a register too quiet and too fast for Elliot's translation device to fully catch. It produced fragments. A word that might have been routine, a word that might have been confirmation, and one word that the device rendered with complete confidence as princess, before apparently deciding that the surrounding context required it to take a brief pause and collect itself. The third thing was what happened to Sarath's bioluminescent markings. They did not accelerate. They did not pulse into any pattern he'd previously cataloged. They went, for approximately 4 seconds, entirely still, and Elliot had enough cultural context by now to understand that this was not calm. This was the thing that lives underneath calm when calm is working very hard. The session was suspended for a short recess. Elliot was escorted with absolute courtesy to a waiting room. Priya appeared beside him in the corridor with the expression she wore when she knew something he didn't and was calculating how much of it was useful to share. He waited. She looked at the wall. He said, "How bad is it?" She said, "It may be nothing." He said, "That's not what I asked." She said, "No, it isn't," and did not elaborate, and they stood in the corridor while the palace around them began, slowly and then less slowly, to change its quality of movement the way water changes when something very large is passing through it somewhere out of sight. The guards did not run. This was the thing that made it worse somehow. Running would have been legible, running was alarm made visible, and visible things can be assessed and categorized. Instead, the guards moved with an increase in pace that was calibrated and purposeful and completely silent. Pairs and then groups of them flowing through the corridors in patterns that were clearly organized and clearly urgent and communicated, without any single person saying a word. That something important had gone wrong, and that the institution responsible for preventing such things had switched from its standard operational posture to the one it kept in reserve for situations it hoped never to actually use. Priya watched two guards pass the waiting room entrance, then looked at Elliot and said, quietly, "The crown princess appears to be unaccounted for." A pause. At present. Another pause. "They're saying it's a precautionary search." Elliot looked at her. She looked back. They had known each other for 4 years and had worked through 2 previous diplomatic incidents together, and they had therefore developed the particular efficiency of people who have learned that sometimes the most useful thing 2 colleagues can do is confirm, wordlessly, that they are both reading the situation the same way, and that the situation is not good. Within 20 minutes, the precautionary search had 400 personnel. Within 40, the intelligence division had been activated, and the palace's atmospheric monitoring systems had been recalibrated to detect juvenile Vihari biosignatures, a process that required overriding 3 separate privacy protocols and filing emergency authorization requests that were approved in under 90 seconds, which told Elliot more about how seriously this was being taken than anything else he'd witnessed so far. He sat in the waiting room and was helpful by being entirely out of the way. Priya brought him a second beverage that tasted like the first one, and the news, delivered in the tone she used for facts she wished were different, that the diplomatic sessions were suspended for the remainder of the day. He nodded. Through the waiting room's single exterior window, he could see a section of the northern corridor, and he watched the guards moving through it with their systematic and relentless thoroughness. And he thought about Saya's face at the back of the reception hall on the first day, the particular quality of her stillness, and the way a child who is bored enough and curious enough will eventually, inevitably, go looking for whatever it is that her particular curiosity is aimed at, because curiosity is not a temperament, it is a direction, and directions, by their nature, go somewhere. He looked at the window. He thought about the humming. He thought about standing in his quarters the previous evening and the faint sound he'd heard, or thought he'd heard somewhere in the corridor outside, the sound of someone stopping briefly before moving on. He thought about the spinning top on his table, and the books with their paper pages, and the photographs that didn't move, and the cards spread on the floor in the particular disarray of solitaire in progress. He thought about all of this for a long moment in the waiting room, while the palace searched every corner and corridor and atmospheric dome, and sealed garden environment with the full mobilized force of 3,000 years of civilization. Then he sat very still, the way a person sits when a thought has arrived that they are not yet sure what to do with, and he looked at the ceiling, which was 6 meters up and did not help, and he thought, with the careful and reluctant honesty of a man who has learned that ignoring inconvenient thoughts in diplomatic contexts tends to make them larger, that perhaps someone should check his room. He did not run. This seemed important to him in the moment, and he would not be entirely sure later whether the restraint had been professional instinct or the simple physical fact that a man who has been sitting in a waiting room for 2 hours on furniture designed for a different species gets up with the careful movements of someone negotiating with his own skeleton. He walked. He walked with the particular purposefulness of a person who has somewhere specific to be and is not yet certain he is right about why, which carried him through the waiting room door and into the corridor before Priya had fully registered that he was moving. She called after him. He said over his shoulder that he was going to check something. She said, with the precision of someone who had been in enough situations to know when a sentence needed to be complete, "Check what?" He said, "My room." There was a pause behind him that had the quality of a person performing a rapid calculation. Then her footsteps followed. The eastern corridor was quieter than the rest of the palace, not because the search had not reached it, It had, twice. But because it had been assessed and logged, and the personnel had moved on to places that the probability models considered more promising. This meant that, when Elliot walked its length, he walked it alone except for Priya, and the corridor's bioluminescent moss gave off its slow light around them, and the only sound was their footsteps and the distant, systematic, increasingly exhausted rhythm of a civilization that had been looking very hard in the wrong direction for 6 hours. He stopped outside his door. He put his hand on the surface. He thought, with the clarity that arrives sometimes in moments of complete uncertainty, that he was either about to resolve an interstellar diplomatic crisis, or he was about to open an empty room, and that both outcomes were survivable, but only one of them was good. He opened the door. Saya was on the floor. The cards were between them, between her and the space where he had been sitting before he'd left for the morning session, as though she had reconstructed his position from evidence and was holding the game open for his return. She had the spinning top in her left hand and one of his photographs in her right, and she was looking at the photograph with the concentrated attention she gave to everything, her silver eyes moving across it slowly. And she looked up when the door opened with the expression of someone who has been so absorbed in a task that the outside world arriving feels slightly unreasonable. She looked at Elliot. She looked at Priya. She looked back at Elliot. She said something in Vahari that his translation device, after a brief pause that he would swear was sympathetic, rendered as, "You were gone a long time." Priya made a sound beside him that was not quite a word. He looked at her. Her face had the quality of a person holding a very large feeling in a very small container. She pressed her communication device and said, with the composure of someone who was going to need several days and possibly a different career to fully process this moment, that the princess had been located, that she was unharmed, and that she was in the human ambassador's quarters. The response from the other end was immediate and came in multiple voices, and his translation device, overwhelmed, produced a single representative rendering. "She is where?" Priya said with admirable steadiness, "The human ambassador's quarters." Another pause. Then the corridor beyond his door began, slowly and then very quickly, to fill with the sound of 430 guards changing direction. Captain Orath arrived first, because of course she did, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the scene with the expression of a decorated officer who has just completed a 6-hour search of an entire space station and found the subject sitting on the floor playing cards. And she processed this with a professionalism that Elliot found genuinely moving. Her markings cycled through something brief and complicated. She contacted the Empress. She used the word unharmed 3 times in 4 sentences, which told him everything about what the last 6 hours had felt like from her side. Then she stood in the doorway and waited, and the waiting had the quality of a very experienced person, deciding that the next several minutes were above her operational pay grade, and she was going to let them unfold without her active participation. Sarath came through the door 11 minutes later, and the room reorganized itself around her the way rooms do around people who are used to rooms doing that. And she looked at her daughter, and the look had everything in it that 6 hours of imperial composure had been keeping somewhere else. Saya looked back at her mother with the clear eyes of a child who understands, on some level, that she has caused a significant event, and who has not yet fully decided how to feel about this, because the 6 hours in question had been, from her perspective, among the better 6 hours recently available to her. The Empress looked at the cards. She looked at the photograph still in Saya's hand. She looked at the spinning top, which Saya had set going at some point, and which was still rotating on the floor between them with the improbable persistence of a well-made thing. She looked at Elliot, who was standing beside his table with the posture of a man composing a sentence very carefully, and he said, "She knocked first," because it was true, and because establishing true things in uncertain rooms was the oldest skill he had. And Sarath looked at him for a long moment, and something moved through her expression that was too fast and too layered for him to fully read, but that had, at its edge, something he recognized as the particular exhaustion of a person who has just been frightened and is now on the other side of it, and finding the other side more complicated than the fear. She picked up the photograph from Saya's hand and looked at it, his daughter, squinting in the recital light. And then she looked at her own daughter, who was looking up at her with the silver eyes that were her mother's eyes in miniature, and the bioluminescent markings on Sarath's collarbone and jaw did something slow and unguarded that Elliot understood, without any translation device, completely. She set the photograph down carefully. She said in the formal diplomatic register that she was grateful her daughter was safe. Then she said something to Saya directly, quiet and not for translation, and Saya stood up from the floor and took her mother's hand. And in the taking of it, there was the whole small, ordinary universe of a child and a parent finding each other after a fright, which is the same across every biology and every civilization and requires no device to render. At the door, Sarath paused. She looked back at Elliot. He met her gaze and held it, because he had learned in 2 days that she respected people who did not look away from difficult things. She said, and his device gave him this one cleanly, that she would like to speak with him in the morning. Not a diplomatic session, a conversation. He said he would be there. She left. Saya left with her, still holding the spinning top, which she had apparently decided was coming with her. And Elliot watched the door close and stood in the quiet of his room for a moment, while Priya sat down in one of the chairs that was wrong for humans, and said nothing with the eloquence of someone who has many things to say and is choosing, wisely, to say none of them yet. In the morning he went. They sat in a smaller room than the summit chamber, with lower ceilings and no formal arrangement, and Sarath had tea that tasted like something real, and she asked him why his daughter was squinting in the photograph. And he told her about recitals and how children perform happiness for parents and secretly prefer to be doing something else entirely. And Sarath looked at the middle distance for a moment and said something that his device translated as yes, and that contained, in the single syllable, an entire conversation about the particular loneliness of children who are watched more than they are known. He did not say anything immediately. He poured more tea. He said eventually that in his experience the children who wander toward interesting things usually turn out fine, and she looked at him with her silver eyes that gave light back differently from any eyes he'd known, and she said, with the precision of someone who has decided to mean exactly what they say, that she hoped he was right. The summit resumed that afternoon. The coordinates were correct this time. The translation device handled agreement with renewed confidence, having been updated overnight with 4 additional contextual inflections, which brought its accuracy on that word alone to something Priya described as genuinely good, which was, in the language of diplomatic translation, the equivalent of a standing ovation. On the last day before the transport came, Elliot sat on the floor of his room and played one final hand of solitaire. The spinning top was gone. One of the photographs had a small fingerprint on it, at the edge, where a hand had held it carefully. He left the fingerprint. He packed everything else. He stood at the window and watched the second sun climb the horizon and do what it always did to the obsidian spires. And he thought about a small girl sitting on his floor asking questions that deserved answers, and about an empress in a small room drinking real tea and saying yes in a way that meant something larger, and about the particular kind of diplomacy that happens when everyone stops performing and someone simply walks through a door because they are curious about what is on the other side. The transport chimed. He picked up his bag. He left the room the way he had found it, except for the fingerprint, and the fingerprint he left on purpose, because some things that have been touched should stay that way.